All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to another Tridium Talk. This is another 4.11 feature sneak peek. Today's topic is the archive history provider. I am Chris Riccobono. I'm a product owner here at Tridium. With me today is Scott Hoy, a senior developer. And with us, as always, our software architect, Blake Puhak, to help with moderation. So let's talk a little bit about the archive history provider today. Learn what it is, what it can provide you to your customers. It's another tool in the tool bag that is Niagara, and we thought it'd be a great idea to show it off with a little TridiumTalk presentation. And as always, we kick it off with a little highlight reel of what's been going on, where we're at with the release, features available. The current release is 4.10 U1. It's now available. This slide is our 4.10 features highlight slide, but I've updated it for 4.10 U1. So this contains the features that came out in 4.10, and I've highlighted some of the additions to 4.10 U1. For those that don't know, 4.10 is earmarked as the long-term supported release. So we create update builds where we will backport security enhancements. And in this particular case, it gave us opportunity to get a specific version listed, and tested, and verified, and listed with the BACnet testing laboratories. And right now, we're aiming for a 4.11 release. That'll be the next release out. And we're actively in the beta program right now. We have a few customer production sites running 4.11, and that just gives us opportunity to get some runtime and some feedback on some of the features before we release them. So I want to thank all the participants as it helps us really vet the software before we release the product. So here's the slide. If you've been tuning into the 4.11 feature Tridium talks, you're familiar with the slide at this point. It's highlighting some of the features coming in 4.11. And today, highlighted, we'll be focusing on the archive history provider. So what is the archive history provider? Probably the easiest way to start explaining it is to maybe take a step back and talk about history collection within Niagara. So we'll start with the left, starting with collection at the JACE. So you have your station running on a JACE. It's got drivers connected to different equipment protocols and equipment controllers. You've got a point in there that represents that object down in the equipment device, and you've added a history extension to it because you'd like to at a particular interval, for example, you'd like to timestamp it and make note of that record. So on the left hand side, you could have your JACE sitting there collecting let's say this numeric writable, and if you collected, say, every minute and just let it run, eventually you'd fill up all the storage and your JACE would stop to run because it's out of space. So the best practice is to start deleting old records to make room for the new records, but you don't want to lose those records. So as most people watching this probably know, you archive to the supervisor. Best practice is to have some consideration to the application in this scenario. With the JACE, it may be practical to simply archive once a day, for example. So you say, take the history and add it to the supervisor, and then take all the records once a day and throw them up at the supervisor. And then you make sure that you're going to store enough records down at the JACE level to account for perhaps downtime between the JSON and the supervisor so that you don't have gaps in your history collection. So then we move into the middle here, or archiving at the supervisor. You're on a PC generally in this scenario, and you could sit there and fill that up. Most of the time, you can just add a bigger hard drive, but we have seen many larger, especially in the enterprise site level stations, whose history databases start to get really big, and multiple gigabytes, and you may have reason to not want to store all of that in one location. So then we have a driver, the RDBMS network, RDBMS driver, that's going to provide you a way to take the history records from the supervisor and send them to an RDB database. Now, in this example, I'm showing off a specific driver that we've offered, the RDBMS network. And in this example, I've added a MySQL database out there. And this allows me to take records of this numeric writable history and create that history in the RDB database and then send the records up there. There's a couple of reasons to do this. Some people just need an RDB database because they want to integrate with maybe other services or third-party apps. Some folks decide, well, I only need probably maybe a month or 3 months worth of history here at the supervisor in the middle. So why don't I'm no longer using this old stuff. Why don't I just send it off to this RDB in case I do need it? I can run a query against the RDB at some time. And again, it doesn't, I'm on the top here, I'm highlighting the RDB network because that's an offering we have. Being that Niagara is extendable, people may have created other drivers or services where they're sending history and data off to some type of remote storage. And so in theory, in practice, that sounds good because you say, all right, well, I'm only going to keep 3 months at the soup, the rest of my data is somewhere else. But therein lies a problem. If I'm only keeping 3 months worth of data at the supervisor and I ask the history service to query the history space that's here in Niagara, I only have access to the 3 months. I can't tell Niagara to go to this remote storage, and if I'm using an RDB driver, I can't tell it to go to that RDB and look for the information there. So I've sent it off and I've deleted it here at the soup. So now I only have access to what I have here in the station. So for my example here, that'd be extreme. I deleted all but 5 records and sent everything off to remote storage. So now when I go to pull up the table for that history, here I only have 5 records and I needed to go back further. So we consider that problem. So how can we solve that? What could we do here to allow someone to stay inside the Niagara ecosystem, but still have access to all their data, regardless of where they put it? And that's how we came up and created the B archive history provider. Now this slide may be directed a little bit more at the developer community in the audience. But if you're an SI installer, bear with me because I think this helps share or explain the bigger picture. So I think it's really good to understand this before we move on to the next segment. B archive history provider, it's part of the public API and it's an abstract class that we created. And what's happening is I explain how when you try to pull up a table in the history space, you're asking the history service to go find the information and return the results. So we've created this class that'll let you implement a component to let the history service know where it can look other than the local Niagara history space. So in my previous example, I talked about using the RDB driver to throw records out there, and I'm only going to hang on to the 5 records at the local space. If I can add this new component to the history service and let the history service know, hey, the numeric writable is not only just here at the local history, it also exists over in the RDB. Niagara can now, if I ask for a table, it can go and fetch the records found at the local Niagara history space and at the same time go and find the records sitting in the RDB. And so while I mentioned this was kind of targeted more towards the developer community, because this is an abstract class, you're not actually going to have the archive history provider component. You're going to take that abstract class and you're going to implement it by creating something, a component, to provide or to let the history space know this is where you will find additional Niagara history. And so what better use for it than creating and offering to the installers with the driver we already provide. So I mentioned earlier, hey, we have this RDBMS driver. It lets you send records and histories off to an RDB. So we're going to take that abstract class and we're going to implement the RDB archive history provider. And so once you've added, and we'll have a demo shortly, so you could see it all, see how the workflow works and how it all works. Once you've added this new RDB archive history provider to your history service, you've now told Niagara where you can find additional records for a given history database. And so if I were to now pull up the table, I'm not just looking at the 5 results that are sitting in the Niagara history space. I'm looking at the complete data set, 5 records at the local and the remaining data set that's found in the RDB. And so joining me today is Scott Hoy, and he will be walking through a nice demonstration so you could see all that in action when using the RDB driver and the RDB archive history provider. So without further ado, I'll let Scott take over and start off his demo.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Chris, can you guys see my screen? It should be showing Workbench.
Yep, I see a Workbench and hear you loud and clear.
All right. Well, thank you. Again, my name is Scott Hoy. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I'm going to show the RDB archive history provider how to drop it in and install it, configure it, and then what it actually does. But again, like Chris was pointing out, the reason we picked the RDB archive history provider is that we already had an RDB driver that we've had for many years that's been exporting history data. So US customers, you may already have many years worth of history data that's in these tables in your relational databases. And so this was low-hanging fruit for us to try out an implementation of an archive history provider that would tap into that data to supplement the local history data that you have. So what I've got here set up is I have a local station running on my PC here. So it's basically a supervisor station. And instead of pulling in points from a JACE, all this stuff will work with histories that come in from a JACE. I've just got some local demo points that I've created. And they've got a funny naming convention, but that just reminds me which database I have exported the histories for these points to. And so if I go down to the history space here, this is a before. I haven't added the RDB archive history provider yet, but I just want to show you what I have set up prior to doing that. And all this stuff is stuff you could do before 4.11. So I have, a history here that I can open up the web chart view for. And if I go back and look at a year-to-date time range, you'll see that I really only have a week's worth of local history data that I've kept locally. So it goes back to October 14th. An easier way to see that is in the history summary view. I just have 672 local history records going back to October 14th. So I do have 11 over 11 years worth of history data that I've exported to a relational database for this history and actually for all of these histories. But what I kept locally was just 672 local rolling records. I have a PX graphic here that I'll use to show a before and after. But basically, this is just for 2 of my histories that I've exported to different databases. It's still showing you that I only have access in Niagara when I open up chart views or applications that are querying the history space. They're just able to see right now what I have locally, which is 672 records year to date. Do want to show you that I have the RDBMS driver installed. Again, this is a driver that we've had for many years. I have connections to multiple relational databases here. I have a local Oracle database that I've got a connection to. It's not running in Niagara, it's a separate process, but I have, Oracle running on my PC as a separate process. I also have MySQL database running locally as a separate process. And then I have connections to a remote SQL Server database instance and a remote Oracle database instance. And within each of these, I've already set up export descriptors, which is how I pushed out, data going back to January 1st, 2010 for each of these histories. And again, this is all stuff that's been there. You can set up export descriptors the way you always have, and you can set up a interval of how often you want to push the data from Niagara to a table in a relational database. And this is all stuff how you set that up. While I'm here, I do want to show you there's a few small tweaks we made to this in 4.11. So if I go to the property sheet here, there's a new property on the history device extension. So this is the container of the descriptors that are doing the exports. There's an always create index for new tables. So the tables that have been exported for history data, sometimes they have indexes that have already been created for them, but there's certain configuration that you could have made in Niagara that would cause an index to not be created. For example, if you had use last timestamp set to true, which is not necessarily recommended for most cases, but if you needed to do that for your case, and this is stuff that's all been documented in the RDB driver, then indexes may not have been created on your tables. And you don't have to create indexes on the tables that are in the relational database driver, but those indexes can help query performance. So now that we're going to be reading the data back into Niagara, it's nice to have those indexes because that can speed up those queries. So if you set this property to true, then going forward for any new tables it creates, regardless of what configuration you have, it'll make sure that indexes are created. If you have existing tables, so if you have an existing station where you've already exported many years worth of history records, and you want to make sure that those tables have proper indexes created, we also have a new action on this device extension, which is to migrate to optimize table indexes. And so if you invoke this, it's actually going to kick off a job. So you can go to the job service and monitor the progress, but basically it's going to connect to the database and walk through the tables and make sure that an index is created that will optimize the queries against it. We didn't want to do that when you upgrade automatically for you, because again, you may want to work with your DBA to make sure that it's okay that you create all these indexes, because it does take up some extra space in your relational database. So we didn't want to just do it, for you. We want it to be more of an opt-in thing. But again, it's completely optional. You don't have to do that, but it can help speed up query performance that we'll see later on when you start accessing histories and dipping into archive data. So that's my RDB network setup. So now let's get to the new stuff. Quickly, if I go to the job service, you'll see that's where the job was, and you can see it walk through the tables, and these already have the proper indexes, but that's where you could see a report of what it did. If I look at the history service, there's a new container in 4.11 underneath the history service called Archive History Providers. And like Chris was saying before, the reason it's here is because any archive history providers you drop in will go in this container, and that lets the history service know where to look for other sources of history data to supplement the local history data. So we wanted to plug it in at a low enough level where any of your applications, any of the chart views, any of the history table views, series transform, BQuery queries, all of those things will just work with archive data now because under the covers, the history service is providing history records for a query to a history that's both local history records supplemented by archive history records. So that's the reason we plug it in at this level. So if I want to now add in an RDB archive history provider to point to one of the relational databases that I have access to, I can go to the RDB palette, and under the RDB palette, there's a new history service archive provider folder. Underneath that is an RDB archive history provider component, which I can drop into this archive history providers container in my history service. It's a lot of words there. But once I've done that, now I can just go configure this guy to tell the history service where to look for archive data. So the two properties you have to set at a minimum are, one, you have to enable it because it's going to be disabled by default, and you can always turn it off later by just disabling it. And then there's an ORD to RDBMS property. This is basically a pointer that tells it what is the RDBMS that I want to look in for archive data. And so in this case, I'm going to point it to the first RDBMS device I have, which is this local Oracle database. I can create others for these other databases that I have also. And once I click save after setting that, you'll notice that the status goes to OK. So now this RDB archive history provider is in effect. Before I move on to show you what it does to my histories, I just wanted to quickly talk about some of these other properties here. This max archive results per query, which defaults to 50,000 records, is basically a limit. So basically any query that taps into the archive, you can limit how many records will come back. And the reason you might want to do that is you may have many years worth of historical records. So you may have millions and millions of records for a given history. And if somebody either accidentally or intentionally does a history time range query that asks for data going back to the beginning of time, you're going to start pulling in millions and millions of records into Niagara to try to display in a web chart or a history table. And that could be unreasonable. So what we have with this limit is it'll still return records, but it'll cap those records at 50,000. So it'll basically truncate the result set to 50,000. It will favor the most recent records for that query. And then you'll get a warning that tells you, hey, your query exceeded the limit here. You may want to tune down your query to something more reasonable. This archive limit notifications property applies to workbench views like the old AX history table and AX chart view. It does not apply to the newer web chart view and the HTML5 history table view. So the new browser-based views have their own way of showing a notification. But for the older views, this property lets you kind of tune how frequently you get notifications. The default is notify once per query range per session, which means that if I do a history query and I exceed the limit, I'll get a notification. But if I refresh that and I submit that same query again, I'm not going to keep getting spammed with notifications for that same query. You may want to turn that off entirely so that if you have never notify as your selection here, then if the limit is reached and you're looking at truncated results, it's just going to do that silently in the background, and you would only know it because you're seeing partial results for that query. And then always notify is the most spammy, which means you're going to get a notification every time you hit the limit for a history query. But again, that can get spammy, so you can kind of choose how spammy you want notifications. And that, again, only applies to workbench-based views. In the browser, when you're looking at the web chart and the history table, there's a different way that those notify you, and I'll show you how that works. These last three properties are typically ones you don't need to change. This is related to how we batch up records when we're retrieving them from the database. So you may have a database set up in a certain way where you want to change the fetch size. You might want to work with your DBA on that, so that gives you the ability to tweak that, but typically you can just leave it at the default and let the JDBC driver do its own fetching of those records using its default fetch size. So let's see what happened. I added in that archive history provider, and now if I go back to that history I looked at earlier and I change my time range to year to date, Well, now I've got records that go all the way back to the beginning of the year. So before I had just a week's worth of data, and that's all it displayed when I asked for year to date. But now it's actually going back to January 1st and showing me all that, because what it did under the covers is it still took those 672 local records, but then it said, hey, archive history provider, do you have any supplemental data for this time range for this history? And it said, yes, I do. And here it is. It went and queried the database and pulled it in. If I go to the history summary view, you'll see that I still have 672 local records. So this again is the local history record count. What that means is that when I did that query, it did not pull those records from the database and then repopulate the local history with that. It didn't pull those records in and persist them again. It only pulls them in on demand when you need them. So when you're doing the query to display the records in a chart or a table, that's when it taps into them, but otherwise it doesn't bloat up your Niagara station again with all those records. Those records remain in the archive. So let me show you real quick what happens if you exceed the archive limit, which again, you can change the archival limit around. This is the old AX history table view. If I pick a time range that goes back to the beginning of time, for example, if I set the start time to none, this would go back and try to pull in 11 plus years worth of history data. But you'll see if I click OK, it actually, well, you get a warning dialog that tells you, hey, you exceeded the limit. And again, it gives you some details on what you can do about that. You can reduce your time range or you can increase the limit. And you'll notice here that the number of records I'm displaying is 50,672. So again, it's the 672 records I had locally plus the 50,000 records that it retrieved from the database, and it truncated it at 50,000 records. There's actually more there, which the warning was telling me, but it's only displaying 50,000. And if I refresh the view, I'm not going to get spammed again with that warning because of that mode that I selected there. If I switch over to the web chart view, which, and all these view, this web chart view is available in the browser, all this stuff works in the browser. And I do something similar where I change to a time range that asks for the beginning of time. Again, it's going to do that truncation. It's going to give me 50,000 records plus the 672 local, but I'm not going to get a warning dialog. Instead, there's a new yellow icon that appears here that tells me, hey, I have some warnings for this chart. And if I click on it, then I see the warning. So it's a little bit different on how it warns you there, but it will be embedded in the view itself. And you can optionally click on it and say, hey, there's something wrong here. What is it? Oh, I exceeded the limit. I should tune down my time range query. So let's go back to the PX graphic real quick and just look at a little before and after here too. So before I was just seeing 672 records. Now I'm seeing 28,170 records available year to date. And that's because my local history is again supplemented. But the history that I have going to my MySQL database is still at 672 records. And so what do I do about that? Well, that's easy enough. I can just drop in another RDB archive history provider and set it up to point to my MySQL database. So then any histories that are in my MySQL database will be able to tap into that. So let's set that up, enable it, point it to my MySQL database, and save that. It's now in effect. And if I go back to that graphic, you'll see that now both of them will show 28,170 records. So pretty easy to do. The important thing to point out there is I can actually install multiple archive history providers. And the sorting order here matters. So for example, you may have a main relational database, and then for redundancy, you have another backup relational database. And if one of them goes down, you want it to fail over to the other one. So you could set up a provider that points to each one of those databases. And then if the main one goes down, when at history query time, it'll detect that and fall through to the next provider and then find that it has history data that it can archive history data that can support the query that you're doing there. Or you may have histories that are separated out into different databases. And so you could just have a provider per database, and that will give you access to the archive history records for histories wherever they live. Now, one thing to note is that if that works fine between histories, but for a single history, you can't have some history records go to one database and then other history records go to another database. It will stop when it finds the first provider that has history records for that history, and that's the only one it'll tap into. But I don't think that's common. I think the more common case is you have histories that are going to different databases, not records for a history that are spread out to different databases. So I think you get the idea there. Any of your applications now, just because I dropped in these providers, can get access to archive history data. One thing, if you want to start using this, you may find that, hey, I can reduce the capacity of my local history records, because before I needed to keep my local history capacities pretty high because I needed to support these queries that went back a couple years. Well, now you can reduce the capacity and basically reduce the size of all those HDB files and basically the space that you're taking up for the Niagara station by reducing the capacity of those local histories to something that still gives you responsiveness for your most common, most recent queries. But if somebody does a bigger query, it can then tap into that remote data. It's still important to know that you still have local histories. That's important. We still need them for navigation. We still need them in case your database connection goes down. The local history can still be collecting records so that when the database comes up, it can put all the records that, you can export the records that happened while the database connection was down and push those up. So there, you still have to have local histories, but you can tune the capacity of those local histories down. There will be documentation on how you can do that in batch if you have existing histories on the supervisor. And the way to do that is just to use the batch editor on the program service, and you can find all your history extensions. For example, if you find history configs, and this is how you would do it for history extensions. And then there's another way you can do it for import descriptors. But basically you can find them and then do a batch edit of the capacity and change the record count to something that is smaller and more reasonable for your case. I would recommend, if you're going to do that, take a quick backup before you do that in case you do something wrong, but that will all be documented. So that's all I wanted to show. I think I'm running out of time here. I'm going to hand it back off to Chris, and then we'll follow up with some question and answer.
Yeah, that was a great job, Scott. This is just a really nice feature in addition to the framework. Really complements our RDB driver. And if you're out there in the audience and you're watching, next question might be, well, how do I get it? How do I use it? How do I get it to my customer? So there's two new features that'll be showing up in licensing. There's the history archive feature and the RDB archive history archive feature. You will find both of these features as they are required in order to run the RDB archive history provider. You will find them now on all of the RDB drivers that we offer. So if you currently have a customer that's using an RDB driver, they've already purchased the option for their supervisor and they're actively using it. When their license rolls to 4.11, you can fetch the new license and you'll now see these features which will allow you to use the RDB archive history provider and your customer to make use of the access to the records in both spaces. That said, this is as with all Niagara, it's about providing the right application to the right problem. So it's about understanding what your customers' needs are, and then making sure we as a software company provide all the tools you will need to meet those demands. So this isn't by any means suggesting, hey, everyone has to start doing this. This is just yet another way you can enhance or make use of the features we provide in Niagara and going forward, if you've seen this and say maybe you have a larger customer that doesn't use an RDB driver yet, encourage them to purchase the option to their supervisor. And starting with 4.11, they'll be able to make use of this and have that great fast access to data regardless of its location. So we're going to wrap up here with just a few slides, and then we'll get to some Q&A. See a couple questions coming in now. We like to finish the Tridium talks up with just a reminder. You can get great content, e-learning content on Tridium University. It's a great website run by the training department. Has both free and paid for content that can help keep you in the loop on new features. A lot of times I know you can take a course and then maybe you're not using something specifically for a long time. So suddenly you have to, next week you got to start doing it. So it's nice to be able to go somewhere to get a little refresher to get you going, get you started. Maybe you really enjoyed this. I hope you did, or you're interested in the previous Tridium talks. You'll find them on our website, tridium.com. Just click on services and support and click on events. And that'll list both upcoming events and all the past saved events as well. And one more place for content, we have our YouTube channel and our YouTube stars, James Johnson and Kevin Mamajak. They both create content there, highlighting and showcasing different features of the framework or just overall best practices and tips. And now we will move to the Q&A.
Thank you, Chris and Scott, for a great presentation. We do have a number of questions that have come in. The first one, I guess for Scott, analytics functions, can they take advantage of the history archive provider?
Yeah, so any application that is making history queries will get the benefit of this, and so that includes analytics, but any applications you may have built that are doing queries to the history database will just work because we implemented this at a low level in the software stack, that being the history module. Then anything above it that makes calls to the histories will benefit from it. So those applications don't even have to know that it's dipped into archive data to supply the results of the query they provided. They just continue to do a history query for a time range, and then they're just getting back history records that they're cursoring through and processing. And so they don't even know that the data came from both local history data and archive history data.
Great. A question about indexing. So if I have a really large database, or it's a multi-part question here for you, Scott. If I have a really large database, is indexing that going to be an expensive operation? While that's happening, are there any impacts to the Niagara station? And after it's indexed, can other clients take advantage of these indices?
Yeah, so indexing, that's really happening on the relational database side. When you kick off that action, Niagara is just interacting with that relational database and walking through its SQL tables and saying, hey, is this a history table that I have exported? And if so, let me check to see if it has an index. If it doesn't have an index, I'm going to go ahead and create one. The index it creates is generically useful. It's basically going to create an index on the timestamp column. So that because when we do queries, we're asking for a time range. And so that's the main thing that it does for the index. So that could be generically useful. I will say that relational databases are not always optimized for storing time series data, but I have seen that the performance works fairly well, especially when you have a proper index. And again, this was low-hanging fruit for us. We've had an RDB driver for many, many years. So in the future, there may be other time series databases that we can build an implementation against. And this is kind of laying the foundation. And then one example to prove it out is this RDB archive history provider. So yeah, I think the answer there is that it can be expensive. So that's why we kick it off as a job that you can monitor that job. So it's kind of an async operation happening in the background. It shouldn't be too expensive on your Niagara station side. Really, most of the work is happening on the relational database. But I would, if you have a really big database like that, I would check with your DBA and just let them know that you're going to do this and that it's basically going to be walking through the history tables and checking the indexes there. He may look at it and say, well, you already have indexes, so you don't need to do that. And that would be fine. So again, that's an optional thing. You don't have to do it. And Niagara will still work even without the indexes. You just may notice that performance is better if you have those indexes.
So speaking of performance, one of the reasons people may want to use the archive history provider is for performance. Can you speak to some of the ways in that using the archive history provider could increase the performance of your local station?
Yeah, so I think it's more about additional scalability. I think performance-wise, it's always going to be faster to query the local history data because that's right there in Niagara, and we've already got the local history data, optimized to do those queries. So, but really what it gives you is a little bit more scalability because now I can offload a lot of those history records that I've been persisting locally, offload them to a relational database or some other database, and then only store a small cache of local records that meet like my most recent queries, and then tap into that relational database as needed to support the longer range queries. So I think query performance wise, you're not necessarily going to see an improvement there. What you will see is that now I have access to more data. So scalability wise, you're going to see the difference.
Great. I would also like to add on station startup times, you may see a difference as well if you use this to reduce the number of records stored locally on your station. And I know you've done a lot of large-scale testing with this, Scott. I don't know if you've gone quite as large as this question is asked, but how would this perform, say, or I guess, do you know how this would perform if we were loading, say, a web chart with 10 histories that each had 100,000 records in them?
Yeah, I can't give you an exact performance number there. I did, when we did some testing as we were building this, and depending on, like, a lot of the databases we've had run locally are just like the free databases, so they're not like the most optimized databases, but we did have a production database that we connected to, and I was doing queries against a relational database that had billions of records in it. I was getting 50,000 records, but I was getting that in less than a second. So that was for an individual history. And those queries, if they're spread out to multiple databases, could be happening in parallel. So I think, I can't give you an exact number there. It really depends on the database you're using and how optimized it is. So there's a couple of factors at play there, but I think you may find that you could try it. If it's acceptable to you, then you're good with that. If not, what you can do is you can tune down that limit to something. So instead of setting it to 100,000, you could truncate it and say 50,000 or 25,000, whatever is suitable for you. But I don't know that you really need to pull in more than 50,000 records for a lot of queries. Usually, you may just want to go back and look at a year's worth of 50-minute interval data, which wouldn't be 50,000 records in itself. But if you tried to go and look at a whole 10-year worth chunk, yes, you could do it, but you may see that it's a little bit slower to have to go out and pull in that many records.
Yeah, so speaking of those limits, do those limits apply to each query or to the entire thing that I'm doing? So say I had 5 histories on a web chart, does that limit apply to each of the queries for each of those histories or for the web chart as a total?
It's each of the queries at the history level. Now the web chart has its own, it does sampling and stuff like that. So the web chart is going to be doing some processing at a higher level, but at the history level where this RDB archive history provider is, it's per query. So if that's 5 separate queries happening, then each of those queries has a 50,000 limit.
Great. With the Niagara database maintenance views, do those interact on the archived histories or only the local histories?
Only the local histories. So once data has been exported to the relational database, we're going to read it, but we're not going to do any like that. That's kind of outside of the scope of Niagara then to maintain that data. So your DBA would be the one to go in if you needed to delete records from a table that you've already exported. That would be an activity for your DBA, not something that Niagara would do there.
Okay. So if I were to modify the records in that remote database, say I had a stored procedure that was creating an average of every 4 records and saving it, could the archive history provider handle bringing that back in, or would we need to use another technique to bring that data back into Niagara?
It depends on where you're writing the data. If you write it to a different table, when you're doing that aggregation and you're keeping the raw data, in the table that was always in, then no, Niagara is not going to access that. So this RDB archive history provider works with our RDB history exports. So the tables that we create from Niagara when we export history data, those are the only tables that we're going to tap into. So the schema there, is timestamp, value, status. We know what that schema looks like because we export it. So we're assuming that that's the table schema we're querying when we read it back. So if you then have a different table that you've processed and it goes to a different table, we don't know to look for it there. So it would not be accessible there. If you happen to modify the raw table, so the table that Niagara generated in the relational database, and you went back and modified that actual table, you kept the columns the way they were, but you changed the values in there, then yes, it would access that. So it really depends on how you do that.
Now,
I don't
if you
know
did
that
want to do some sort of aggregation that remote database and create, say, monthly averages and store that in a new table, you could use the RDB history import to bring that into Niagara and store it as a local Niagara history.
That's true. Yep. Yes. That's another way to work around that problem, is to use the import to pull it back in as a separate history.
Chris, I have a question that I think may be a little more appropriate for you. Do you have any advice or best practices on when to archive based on, whether it may be a change of value history or a regular interval type of history?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can give the old tech support response of, well, it depends. So obviously, you may have a piece of equipment or you get some type of Boolean point that's just rarely ever changing, and so if you're only saving 3 months worth of data, maybe it's a piece of equipment that runs 24/7, so the records you have for it may only be but 1 or 2. That's okay. There isn't really a best practice. What's needed to be understood is, what does your customer need? So when are they pulling up a chart where they're making comparisons to that, maybe that change of value to some other records? And if they are, you may need to adjust the record count and the archiving according to that particular need. If it's not an issue, then you can kind of come up with the standard calculation or practice yourself and apply it to the station. It all depends on how someone's going to be using it. You don't necessarily have to tweak something just to tweak it. It's probably best to understand if you need to bother with that tweak at all, because maybe it just it won't be applicable or needed.
And I guess another question for you, Chris. Can you speak to Niagara's current state, specifically around the archive history provider when it comes to 21 CFR compliance?
Yeah, so that's part of the design intent was to help with that compliance. We offer the e-signature. It's a separate offering and feature that is. It doesn't mean just because you bought it, you're now compliant. It just means here's some additional tool sets to allow you to configure a station to be compliant. So there isn't some golden list of rules you have to follow to make a compliant software. It's about getting something set up at the site, and then the FDA comes in and actually qualifies how something's been configured to be compliant. So this is just another way to provide that kind of either redundant space or you can archive stuff to a remote location, but you can still access it without having to keep the records in both locations.
And final question here on licensing. You mentioned the new features that people will need in order to take advantage of this. How do our customers go about getting these features added to their licenses?
Yeah, so as soon as 4.11 comes out, any license that's in good standing with its SMA, the software maintenance agreement, will automatically on the server side rolls up to 4.11 and gets the features added to applicable licenses. And so in this case, these features are being added to the RDBMS driver part. And so if you have a license that is licenses you to run Niagara as a supervisor, and you've already purchased the driver, RDB driver of a specific RDB, your license will now have that feature added to that part. And so when you go to view your license after the 4.11 release, you'll see that these new features under that given part.
Great. We have a question about developing. We mentioned that it is a new public API. So we had a question about how is this documented? We do have documentation on it in our Baja doc that you can view. I've looked at it. It is very extensive documentation and should make it very clear as to what you need to document. And perhaps we'll do a future developer Tridium talk or a session at the upcoming Niagara Summit on how to implement your own archive history provider. And
the name of that class is Be Archive History Provider if you're searching for it. It's the one that Chris showed on that slide. So if you look at the Baja doc for that, it will tell you the methods that you need to implement.
And that class is in the history module.
Yep.
And one final question for you, Chris. Everyone's really excited about 4.11. When can they get their hands on it?
Yeah, always a good question. So right now we are in the beta program. Our intent is to have it released within the upcoming weeks. The trick to releasing a version is we're actively looking for any defects that that might have not been found until we get it out on a site and get some runtime on it. So I can't commit to anything because you never know what tomorrow will bring, but if all goes well, it should be in the hands of our SIs and OEMs in the upcoming weeks.
Well, thank you both, Chris and Scott. This was a great presentation this afternoon or this morning.
Yeah,
thank you.
it absolutely was. Thank you so much, Scott. It was a wonderful demo, and thanks as always, Blake, for the moderation. And I appreciate the audience, and I hope everyone enjoyed it.